Hello, my name is James Sanderson. I'm the evangelism minister here at the Brown Street Church of Christ in Waxahachie, Texas. And yes, it's a little bit cold here today. Being from Michigan, when we got cold, we just got cold. When winter came, it just stayed. Texas is not that way. One day it's 85 degrees, and the next day it's 40 or 30 or 20, and it's up and down. So takes a little getting used to. We're on one of our cold days today, but uh, yeah, I don't miss all that snow. Hey, we're in the book of Romans. We are in a series going through this book, and this book is it's a deep book. It really is. I think it's the deepest book in the entire Bible. You'll be blessed if you read it. You'll be blessed if you really take it to heart and really understand it. Because what it does is it brings the entire Bible together. And it is unlike any other book in the Bible. And it's a great book. And so I'm glad you're with us today. Uh, Continue. You'll be blessed today, I promise you. Today we're going to understand how faith plays a part in the gospel. Paul's been taking us through the gospel, and we're gonna get deep into faith. All right, you're gonna see this subject of faith deeper than I think that you've ever seen it before. And when I got done giving this class, I literally jumped because it was amazing. It finally came together for me. So this is lesson 6, and we're going to get into chapter 4. So when you're in the book of Romans, just kind of put yourself in that mindset and understand where you're at, where these people were at when Paul writes to them. It was a different world than ours, but different gods, different religions, persecution, taxes, Caesars, wars, crime. Well, maybe it's not so much different than our world, because our world is getting more and more like that every day, it seems like. But that's the world they lived in. Would have been a difficult way of life as a Christian. Let's remember the purpose of why Paul is writing. Whenever you get in a New Testament book, it's really important to look for the purpose of the writing. And this one is easy to find. Why did Paul write? He is bringing them the gospel, the good news. And that is found in chapter 1. So that's what he's bringing to them. Now, who is he bringing this to? Well, his audience is who? It's Christians. And these Christians have already obeyed the gospel. And yet, Paul is going to spend this entire book bringing them the good news. But they're made up of a couple different groups of people, these Christians. It's both Jews and Gentiles. And I think this is probably what makes it difficult for us to understand the book of Romans, because it's hard for us to put ourselves back into a Jewish mindset or a Gentile mindset of their world. They both have backgrounds. They're both coming from different places. It's like that today, where the church is made up of all kinds of different kinds of people and different backgrounds, of religious beliefs and things that they've seen, okay, and places they've been, things they've experienced. But we really need to try to understand what that Jewish mindset was, or that Gentile mindset was. And if we can, this book, the Bible, is going to make a lot more sense. And that's going to be the real struggle. Paul's going to bring these two groups up today. Now, when he brings them the gospel, he first takes them to the bad news. And he spent a good 3 chapters discussing the bad news. And what was the bad news? We're all sinners. And what does sin do with you and God? It separates you from God. That's right. And this whole world is in it. All right. And I don't think any of us really understand how bad it is to be separated from God. We don't, apparently our world doesn't understand it. That's why it's our job to bring that to them. That they've got a serious problem when they are in this state. But it's bad. But once you understand that, and Paul does a good job of explaining just how bad that is, then he brings them back up and he brings them to the good news. And where does that good news point to? Whose name does it got written on it? Well, we saw it last week. It's Jesus. Jesus is the good news, because what did it say in 3:21? He is the righteousness of God. None of us are righteous except for him. He is the one that ushers righteousness into this world. None of us can do that because we're all unrighteous. He is the heart of God's saving grace. Okay, if you think about the word grace, Jesus is the center of that. Okay, he is our Redeemer. Chapter 3, verse 24. He redeemed us. He brought us back out of this life of slavery to sin. And what did it cost? The highest price that heaven can pay. The very life of Jesus. There is no higher price that we've been bought with. When you go to Romans 3:25, depending on the translation that you use, it says that Jesus is our propitiation. And propitiation is a biblical word that means satisfy. So Jesus has satisfied God's wrath against our sins. And how can he do that? How can he only be, why is he the only one that can be God's satisfaction? It's because he's righteous. And none of us are. So none of us could ever satisfy God's wrath against our sins. And that's why Jesus came. And if you use a different translation in that same verse, it could be that Jesus is our atoning sacrifice. So that's a little different angle. The words are very much alike, but there's a little bit of difference. And this would point to the Ark of the Covenant, where there was the mercy seat, where the high priest took in the blood, sprinkled it on the mercy seat, and in between the cherubim, God's defenders of righteousness, God's laws, is Jesus' blood. It covers us. It covers our imperfections. Jesus is the heart of the gospel. Jesus is the most important part of the gospel. But I got a question for you. Is there another part? Is there another part that plays a piece in the puzzle for the gospel to work in our lives? Well, there is. That's our part. We actually play a part in this, okay? And that is called faith. Faith. And Paul is going to talk about faith. So when you see the word faith in the Bible, faith here is used as a noun. The word believe is used as a verb. And trust, they can be interchanged in the Bible. Having faith, believing, trusting, they're all basically the same word. And so when you go through the Bible and you look at the book of Romans, you're going to see these words interchanged, but they all mean the same thing. Having faith, believing, trusting in God. Now, when we look at this word faith, there's a lot of people that look at this word faith and they teach a doctrine from this in our religious world. So this is what they do with this concept of faith. They come up with this theology. And that is called the faith-only doctrine. And what do I mean by that, or what do they mean by that? Well, they mean that all you have to do is just acknowledge God, and at that moment, you're saved. Okay? All I have to do is just have faith. And I don't have to do anything else. That's it. And I'm saved. God did his part. I did my part. There's salvation. Now, the question is, where do they get that from? They actually get that from the book of Romans. Romans is going to, in their mind, support this kind of thinking. Now, I don't know where you're at. I don't know where your thinking is based on that. But what we're going to do is we're going to see if that is a true theology or not. Okay? When we go through the gospel, we want to make sure, and we've already dealt with some, that we don't have false theologies. Because if we have false theologies, it could change the gospel. And Paul talked about that in Galatians, that if anybody brings you a different gospel than the one we brought to you from God, let him be eternally condemned, even if it's an angel from heaven. So we want to make sure that we get the right gospel and we don't interject false theories or theologies into it. Does that make sense? Yeah. Let's get started today. So here's where we left off last week. It's actually in chapter 3, and this is going to be a launching pad to bring us to the next part of Romans. Romans 3:27 says, then what becomes of our boasting? Okay? We do that a lot, right? We boast about ourselves, what we've done, what we've accomplished, okay? It is excluded. Paul's saying there's no room for that here. There's no room for that in the gospel. By what kind of law? By a law of works? No. But by a law of faith. You see how Paul's contrasting the two? Okay? Works of law, right? Works of faith. For we hold that one is justified by faith apart from the works of the law. Or is God the God of the Jews only? He is not the God. Is he not the God of Gentiles also? Yes, of Gentiles also. So now Paul is bringing in both Jew and Gentile. And again, can you just imagine them sitting across the pews looking at each other? They're in Rome with totally different backgrounds, right? Bringing these different things into the church, their luggage, in a sense. I got my background, I got my beliefs, you got your background, you got your beliefs. Paul's saying, look, God's the God of all you people. Verse 30 says, God is one who will justify the circumcised. Now Paul's going to use this concept of circumcision. And we're going to see in a minute, circumcision was very important to the Jewish people. He will justify the circumcised by faith, that's the Jews, and the uncircumcised through faith. It's got to be the Gentiles. Do we then overthrow this law by this faith? By no means. On the contrary, we uphold the law. Okay? So there is our launching pad into chapter 4. Now, did you read some verses here? It's not by works of law, it's by faith. Boy, that could really help support this faith-only doctrine, couldn't it? Sure could. Can you see where that kind of thinking can come from? I don't have to do any works. I just have to have faith. Okay? Now Paul is going to move to this character in the Old Testament, Abraham. Now we think of the gospel, we think of Jesus, we think of the New Testament. And yet Paul, when he's teaching the gospel, he's actually going to go back and use an Old Testament person, Abraham. And he's not only in the Old Testament, but he's specifically living in a certain time of the Old Testament. He is living before the law of Moses. Okay, that's important here. Time for a drink of water here. Excuse me for that. So here's Paul using Abraham. Paul loves to use Abraham in his teachings. Chapter 4, what then shall we say was gained by Abraham, our forefather according to the flesh? For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, right? But not before God. For what does the scripture say? So here's Paul. He's going to use Abraham, and he's going to go back, and he's going to quote from Genesis 15, verse 6. Paul's going to reach back in that Old Testament, tell us a story about Abraham. And this is very important. Abraham believed God, and it was counted, or it was credited to him as righteousness. right? So here's when Abraham, he puts his faith in God, and what is credited to his account? Righteousness. Abraham's not righteous. He's unrighteous, right? No one is righteous, not one. Romans 3:10, that would include Abraham, right? So no one is righteous, but he's counted or credited as righteousness. All right? Now, verse 4. Now to the one who works, his wages are not counted as a gift, but as his due. Right? You go to a job, you put in so many hours, you do this, this, and this, and you get a paycheck. And it's given to you. It's not given to you as a gift. No, because you earned it. And so they give it to you because you earned it. All right? Verse 5. And to the one who does not work, but believes him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is counted or credited as righteousness. So again, you can see here where Paul is pointing to. He's pointing to the one not that works, but the one who has faith. You see that? Okay? Now, when you look at this, you could say, well, there it is, James. There's your faith only. You don't have to do anything. All you have to do is acknowledge God. You're counted as righteous. That's what looks like it happened with Abraham. And there's the doctrine of faith only. Now, one more time over here in Genesis 15:6. Let's go back to Genesis. Here's the NIV. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. I like that word credit. But again, one more time. He believed, and he's made righteous. Faith only doctrine. Again, you can see where this is coming from. Okay? But let's talk about Abraham. You guys know about this, don't you? Yeah, I know about this. Got plenty of plastic in our wallets, don't we? Credit cards, right? So here you go up to the gas station and get some gas, and they give you gas on credit. When you drive away, actually no one has paid for that gas. Not yet. If you use this kind of card, who are they banking that's going to pay them? It is Visa. The gas company could care less if you pay for that gas or not. They want to make sure that Visa pays them for that gas. Visa then will take it up with you if you pay for it. Okay? That's another story. So who pays for the gas here when this happens? It's actually Visa. So here we are. We got this card here, right? And then we're talking about our salvation, our righteousness. Where does the credit for our righteousness come from? If I'm not righteous, and you're not righteous, and Abraham's not righteous, and none of us are righteous, then how does that credit of righteousness, how does it come to us? Who's the card holder in a sense for this righteousness? Who brings us this righteousness? It's Jesus. He's the only one. There's nobody else on the planet that is righteous except for him, right? So when we look at this timeline, here's this timeline. Where does that credit for righteousness come from? So here's Jesus. He comes in about 4 BC. He dies in approximately 29 AD. And he brings this righteousness into the world. And here's Abraham, that lived about 1,800 years before Jesus ever got here. And he is credited with righteousness. What did Abraham have to do? He had to do what? He had to have faith. He had to believe. And once he believed, he's credited with righteousness. There you go. Saved by grace through faith. There it is. There it is. Okay? Now, what Paul's contrasting here is he's looking at a faith of merit. So here's a Boy Scout. He's got his merit badge here, okay? So he learns how to, sailboat, or he learns first aid, or he learns how to camp or whatever, do a bonfire. He gets merit. He gets these badges, and he puts on this merit badge. And you give him these little round things because he earned them. The proper faith in God is this. Now you think about Noah for a minute. Did Noah work? He sure did. Did he work based on God's commands? Oh, he did. What was he told to do? Build an ark. And he builds that ark, and then he has to get himself on. Okay? But when Noah gets off that ark, does he beat his chest and go, look what I've done? I just saved myself. Not at all. Who does he give the credit to? He gives the credit to God. He does an animal sacrifice to God and says, thank you, God, for saving me. Even though even though Noah worked, he gives the credit to God. Right? That is the proper faith in God. The credit doesn't go to us. The credit goes to him. The credit goes to him because he did the work. And that work, his name is Jesus Christ. You got it? So where's the boasting? Don't be like this guy. I told the class the other night when I was teaching this, I said, look, if you guys bury me here in Waxahachie, Texas, if you guys have a funeral, don't get up there and talk about all the great things I've done, okay? Because I'm just a sinner, okay? I'm a mess, right? Who we need to be pointing to? Point not in that funeral to me. Why don't you point to Jesus? Why don't you just have the whole, however long you're going to talk, and talk about Jesus, okay? Point to him, all right? That's where our boasting should come. So we should never do this, and we should always do that. And that is the proper way to have faith in boasting God. Now, Paul is going to move to David, another Old Testament character. Now, when he chooses David to illustrate the gospel, he's actually going to use a person who is under the law. Abraham was not under the law. That didn't happen until Moses came. But David was. So watch what he says here. Verse 6. Just as David also speaks of the blessings of the one whom God counts righteousness apart from works. Apart from works. Righteousness is accounted to David apart from works. And then he's going to quote from David. Okay, so he's going to go back to Psalm, which David wrote, chapter 32, verses 1 and 2. He says, blessed are those whose lawless deeds are forgiven and whose sins are covered. Blessed is the man against whom the Lord will not count his sin. So, David's receiving this blessing. Where does the blessing come from? David didn't mention himself in here. He didn't mention about all the great things he had done. Who's he pointing to? The Lord. The Lord gets the credit. And that's what a proper faith in God does. It points to God, not to us. Okay? The boasting is in him, not in us. Does that make sense? Now he's going to move back to Abraham. And then he's going to bring in this word circumcision. So let's see what he says here. Verse 9, is this blessing then only for the circumcised? Right? Or also for the uncircumcised? Well, we've already seen that, haven't we? For we say that faith was counted to Abraham as righteousness. It was credited to his account, right? How then was it counted to him? Was it before or after he had been circumcised? It was not after, but before he was circumcised. Right? We're going to see that in a minute here. He received the sign of circumcision as a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. Circumcision means a lot to a Jewish person. Okay? So here's that Jewish person sitting in those pews, hearing this letter written from Paul. Okay? So let's take Abraham. Here's Abraham, and he is credited with righteousness. What chapter was that? That was Genesis 15. Now, when is Abraham instructed to be circumcised? That is chapter 17. So, was he made righteous when he was circumcised, or was he made righteous when he believed. It was in chapter 15, not in chapter 17. Okay? That's where he's made righteous at. The purpose is to make him the father of all who what? Believe, without being circumcised, so that righteousness would be counted to them as well. So can righteousness be credited or accounted to people who are circumcised and to people who are not circumcised? Yes. Yes, it can. And you can see, though, how important this was to the Jews. The Jews are coming here in the New Testament. They're going, wait a minute. Wait a minute. Chapter 15, verse 1 says that certain men came down from Judea and taught the brethren, unless you were circumcised according to the customs of Moses, you can't be saved. And Paul is going to argue back to them and go, wait a minute. Wait a minute. That's not true. Okay? But you can see how important circumcision was to a Jewish person. And why? Well, because they were commanded to do that. They absolutely were. That was to the Israelites, right? And so if you have faith, you're going to be circumcised. And these Jews are like, they ain't being circumcised. You got to be circumcised. But that was to who? That was to the Israelites. It wasn't to the Jewish person. So it's important to them. If Abraham was circumcised before he was justified, then the Jewish person in the audience at Rome might argue that justification, it only applies to Jews and not for Gentiles. But if Abraham was uncircumcised at the time he was justified, made righteous, right? Then other uncircumcised people, like Gentiles, might be justified also. And thus that would make Paul's argument for justification for Gentiles, it would stand up, right? It would work. And that's the point he's making here. I told you this book is deep. So just as condemnation reaches everybody, right? Remember this chart I did a while back? Right? Jews and Gentiles before the law, Jews and Gentiles during the law, Jews and Gentiles after the law. It doesn't matter if you're under the law of Moses, not under the law of Moses. Guess what happens to everybody? They're all guilty. They're all under sin. Okay? It doesn't matter where you're at. So condemnation comes to everybody. Okay? But not only does condemnation come to everybody, but can faith reach everybody also? It can. That's right. Right? So it doesn't matter if you're Jew or Gentile before the law or during the law or after the law or what you're under, faith can come to all of those people. And let me give you an example of this. Okay? So all can have faith. Now remember, faith is a choice. So it's not an automatic. Okay? But it can come to everybody. It's possible. It's possible. It's there. But you can't please God without having what? You can't please God without having faith. That's what Hebrews 11:6 says. And without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists. Right? So if you want to be pleasing to God, what do you absolutely have to have? Faith. There is no way on the earth to be pleasing to God without having faith. There's no exception. You've got to have faith. Now, what do you got to do? Believe that he exists. Well, there it is, James. All you have to do is acknowledge God, and you don't have to do anything. There is your doctrine of faith only. But read the rest of the verse. And that he rewards those who what? Earnestly seek him. Earnestly seek him. Now that's doing something, isn't it? Absolutely. And here the writer of Hebrews, whoever that was, we're not sure who it was, he's saying, look, if you're going to be pleasing to God, you got to have faith, and that faith has to do something. It has to earnestly seek God. So does this teach faith-only doctrine? No. Only if you take the top part of the verse, but the second part is clear. It does not teach that. In fact, here is some action. Faith can only come about by what? By hearing. Faith comes by hearing. Hearing. Okay? So you got to hear something. An action actually has to take place for you to have faith. And that's what the book of Romans says. So then faith comes by hearing and hearing from the Word of God. Now remember, we kind of tried to stretch our minds a little bit and go, what about all these other people that we don't really know a lot about? How in the world did those people have faith? If faith has to come by hearing, they must have not had any chance for heaven. And again, does this teach the faith only doctrine? No. You got to hear it. There has to be an action. It has to take place. So I think about Enoch. Enoch was way back there in the Old Testament, right? Almost the creation. And what does it say about Enoch? He walked with God. He walked with God, and he walked with God, and he walked with God. And then it was getting late. God was like, I'm closer to my house than we are to yours. Why don't you just come on home with me? I like that little story. It's not in the scriptures, but it makes a lot of sense. I just like that. He walked with God. How can you walk with God if you don't know about God? Apparently, God had gotten his information to him that he exists. And he believed that. And so he walked with God. Faith comes by hearing. Now, I don't know how Enoch found that out. I don't know who went to him. I don't know if God talked to him. I have no idea. But I know that he had faith, and it comes by hearing. How about Melchizedek? When we think of the Bible and stuff, we're moving through the Bible. We're going over here to Adam and Eve, and then all of a sudden, okay, now God's moving through the Israelites. With Abraham, he's the first one and moves through there. What about Melchizedek? Melchizedek and Abraham met. They lived at the same time. And who is Melchizedek? The priest of God. Well, how can you be the priest of God if you don't know about God, right? So apparently he knew about God. He was taught about God. He was instructed about God. How did that happen? I don't know. But apparently it happened because faith comes by hearing. It has to. How about Balaam the prophet? Remember Numbers chapter 22? Here's the Israelites, and they're working through they're working towards the promised land. And they get almost to the promised land, and then they run into this guy named Balaam. He's the prophet of God. And God's talking to him. He's getting instructions from God. He's giving instructions from God. He's a prophet of God. He's not an Israelite. At least I don't see anything in the text about him being an Israelite. Where did he come from? Who talked to him? Who told him about God? I don't know. But apparently, he must have had that information because faith comes by hearing. You can't be a prophet of God without hearing. Now, later on, God killed this guy, put him to death because he left God and got away from God. And God destroyed him. But up until that point, he's a prophet of God. How about Rahab? Right? She hid the spies. So they're going into the promised land. They get to the town of Jericho. They cross the Jordan. They get to Jericho. And who do they find? Rahab the prostitute, a Gentile. She had heard about the Israelites. And she hides the spies by faith. Right? Same faith that Enoch had. They're both in Hebrews 11. She must have known something about God. Who went to her? Who told her? Who talked to her? I don't know. But she knew something about God. And she had faith because faith comes by hearing. How about Nebuchadnezzar? Think God doesn't work in Gentiles' lives? It looks like he actually wrote part of Daniel chapter 4. Go back and read that because he says, I. A Gentile writing the Bible? Look at the story in Daniel chapter 2. Look at the story in Daniel chapter 3. Look at the story in Daniel chapter 4. That was God working in that man's life. He's not an Israelite. God was doing some things behind the scenes. How about Nineveh? They repented, right? Jonah went to them and told them about God, and they repented. Their repentance was moved by what? By faith. And that faith comes from what? From hearing. Did God bless them? He did. And then what about the wise men? Where did they come from? They came from the east. Well, who are they? I don't know. But something moved them to go all the way, follow the star, and go all the way to Jerusalem and then Bethlehem to worship Jesus. Where did they get that information from? I don't know. Who went and told them? I don't know. But they did it by faith, and faith comes by hearing. They had to be told the Word of God. So if we're going to have faith, there has to be some action, doesn't there? Do you see that? We've got to be told, and then we have to do something with what we've been told. And all of those people did. It's through faith. And as we've seen, and we will continue to see, faith has action. And where do we get that information from? The book of Romans. It does. It says it in the beginning of the book. It says it in the middle of the book. And it says it at the end of the book. That faith has obedience. And obedience is what? Action. So what does it say here in Romans 1:5? We already read this about a month ago. Through whom we have received grace and apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith for the sake of his name among the nations. The obedience of faith. So if you have faith, there's going to be action, obedience. That's the beginning of the book. Let's look at the middle of the book. Romans 6:17, but thanks be to God that though you used to be slaves to sin, outside of God, right? You did what? You wholeheartedly obeyed that form of teaching to which you were entrusted. Somebody came and taught them, right? And then what happens? You've been set free from sin and have become slaves to righteousness. So, what do you have to do to become a slave to righteousness? You have to wholeheartedly obey the form of teaching to which you were entrusted. That is the faith of the Bible. And then the end of the book says, chapter 16, verse 26, but has now been disclosed, and through the prophetic writings it has been made known to all nations, according to the commandment of the eternal God, to bring about the obedience of faith. What comes from faith? Obedience. The two are a package, right? You have to have obedience. That's the end of the book. Now back to Romans. Now we're going to see that in this very chapter, chapter 4. Getting back to Abraham. And to make him the father of the circumcised, who are not merely circumcised, but who also, here it is, walk in the footsteps of the faith that our father Abraham had before he was circumcised. That's right. So where did he start walking by faith? Well, let's see. Now, is this faith only doctrine? No, because here it's saying that faith has to walk. Faith has to have action. If I believe this faith only doctrine, all I have to do is acknowledge God. That's not coming from the book of Romans. I am misunderstanding this chapter, and I'm misunderstanding the Bible, and I'm misunderstanding the book of Romans. So let's go back to Abraham. What did he do? Well, he starts over here in the land of Ur, right? And he's told to do what? Go to the promised land. Now, if he's going to do that, he's got to pick up his feet and walk. He has to move, right? And where's the promised land at? Over here in the land of Canaan. But do you remember his journey? He steps off up here in Haran. Haran's not the promised land. Do you know how many years he stopped for? 5. 5 years. 5 years he stopped. Let me ask you a question. You're on this journey of faith. Have you ever fallen on your face? Right? Just kind of slipped up. Maybe not moving like you should be. Yeah. But then Abraham gets moving again. And he eventually gets to the land of Canaan. All right. He's there. But then what does he do? He leaves. Nobody told him to leave. Well, when he got there, there's a famine in the land. He's like, I can't survive here, so I've got to do something. But God didn't tell you to do that. So he goes down there and gets himself in a hot mess. You know, he's got himself a real problem. And what does God do? He blesses him, takes care of him, just like God does sometimes with us, right? When we get in these messes, I shouldn't say sometimes. He gets us through. But what did Abraham do? He went back to the place he thought he couldn't survive, and he ends back up in Canaan. So at the end of the day, where's Abraham at? He went to the promised land. He did what God was telling him to do. But sometimes he falls short. And that's the key. Faith doesn't have to be perfect. Because if it is, I'm done. I'm not. I'm not. And see, if I was, then where would the boasting be? Right here. I was perfect, but I'm not. Who was? Oh, his name is Jesus. So who do we boast in? We boast in him. But that doesn't nullify that. I don't have to do. That doesn't nullify that I don't have to do what God asked me to do. I still have to do. But he gets the credit, not me. Don't look at me, right? Don't talk about me at the funeral. Talk about him. So when people take this and they go, see, Abraham, all he had to do was acknowledge God over here in Genesis 15:6. That's all he had to do, right? But that's not the full story. Because what did he do before that? He obeyed God, right? And that obedient faith, not perfect faith, but obedient faith, God credited as righteousness. Do you see that? That's how it works. But the boasting doesn't go to Abraham. It goes to who? It goes to God. There you go. Now we balance the book of Romans. Now we balance the Bible. So when we look at this works of merit, I did this and you owe me, right? I accomplished this and you owe me. That boast in self. Okay? But a work of faith is what Noah had. He worked, he built, he did what God told him to do, built that ark like he told him to do, got on that ark. But when he gets off that ark, who does he point to? He boasts in God. And that is a work of faith, not a work of merit. Works of merit is what Paul is talking against here. Works of faith is what he's talking in favor of. And that's what we have to have as works of faith, because faith works. But it doesn't have to be perfect. So if I'm going to have the faith that the Bible talks about, it's going to be a faith that works. If I lived during the time of Noah, what would I have done? God told me to build an ark, build an ark. Okay, get on. I'm not building an ark today. Why not? Because God didn't tell me, right? So my faith isn't based on that. But if I was living during the time of Noah, right, or not Noah, but Moses, I'm supposed to do animal sacrifices, and go to the temple and worship, and keep the Day of Atonement and Passover and Pentecost, right? But am I doing any of those things? No, because that's not what my faith is based on. I live under the new covenant now. So what I need to do is I need to get in the new covenant and find out, God, what do you want me to do here? And he tells me what to do. And that's going to be the rest of the book of Romans. What do you want me to do, God? And do that. And that's the faith that the Bible teaches. And that's the faith that pleases God. So don't ever think that we don't have to do. But also, as we do, and you fall flat on your face, get back up and keep moving to God. You've got to move. Faith has a pulse, and it's got to keep going. I pray you've been blessed today. I hope this book of Romans is making sense. I hope you're understanding faith better. When I got done with this class Wednesday night, I mean, I just jumped because I was so excited because it's like, I get it. I get it. I hope I made this clear for you today. I've done this video 4 times, and so I probably looked a little wore out in this last one here, but I hope I got the message over to you well. God bless you guys. Hey, we'll see you next time. Let's get into the word grace and faith and bring those two together in the next part of chapter 4. We'll see you next time. God bless you.